Ramsden, the man behind so many of Barrow's wealth-creating schemes, also set up the jute works in 1872, with the idea of providing work mainly for women and children. It eventually became the largest jute factory in England. These were the works which were opened by the Barrow, Flax and Jute Company, and they made use of the female labour in the town. Women were getting more and more opportunities to go out to work and take charge of their lives. Many got jobs at places like the steam laundry around the time of the First World War. There was also a place for women in the steelworks and shipyard, and more were turning to professional work.
There were more opportunities for women, certainly in the Edwardian period and in the 1920s and 30s, for them to start their own businesses and to do other things. Of course, in Barrow, the problem was that the town was in depression, and therefore there weren't as many opportunities in some ways to earn money as there would have been in others. But there were more opportunities, and women were able to take advantage of that.
The magnificent Victorian Town Hall seems a world away from the image of the English Chicago. It is a symbol of local government, but this was a long time in coming for Barrow. The only form of local government until the 1860s was based at nearby Ulverston and Dalton. The Furness Railway and leading industrialists also held some unofficial control over the town, but it was inefficient. And so in 1866, a petition was drawn up for a charter of incorporation. The charter was granted the following year, and it meant that a borough council could be formed. Not surprisingly, the influential James Ramsden was elected the first mayor. The new town hall was planned in 1877, but various design problems and economic uncertainty meant that it did not open until 1887 as part of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrations. It had cost £70,000, and in many ways it symbolised an optimistic belief in Barrow's future prosperity. But this progress had already begun to falter by the time the town hall opened for business. A nearby hostelry is a reminder that the Marquis of Hartington opened the town hall with a special gold key, and he was presented with the freedom of the borough. The event marked yet another milestone in Barrow's development. Facilities and services were improving all the time, and the efforts of the new borough council helped to accelerate this. Firefighting needed to be better organised. A voluntary fire brigade had been formed in 1866. The idea had come from the church wardens of St. George's. There was one superintendent, one sergeant and 10 firemen. There was a manual engine, hose reel cart and ladders, which had cost a total of £190. But the volunteer brigade did not prove effective, and it was taken over by the council in 1867. The central fire station was based on Abbey Road for many years and opened just before the First World War. It took the place of a tin shed, which was on the present police station site. In those early days, the service had one captain and 23 firemen, along with 5 branch stations. The police also became better organised. Before 1881, Barrow had been policed as a separate division of Lancashire, but there were complaints that there was a lack of police presence on the streets. But things started to improve after the borough got its own force. A chief constable was appointed, with about 50 other ranks, and Barrow at last had its own constabulary. Social changes also meant there was more time for leisure. The corporation bought Bigger Bank as a public recreation ground. It attracted hundreds of people during the summer months. Not many industrial towns could boast that they had special holiday facilities for their workers. It cost just a few pence on the ferry, and a family could get as much sea and sand as they wanted. During bank holiday periods, Pierrots would entertain the crowd from a stage. There were other attractions like the open-air swimming pool. This was a favourite for people of all ages. It was built around 1930, and people flocked to it for decades in the years before foreign package holidays became more affordable. Nearby Vickerstown was enthusiastically described as a marine garden city, and the crowds flocking to Bigger Bank helped to back this claim.
The attractions on Biggar Bank were the fact that you could spread out onto the greenery and onto the beach, but also, of course, there was the pavilion, which provided you with hot teas and ice creams and things like that. And also, in later days, there was the open-air swimming pool, which was a great attraction for everybody, because there, regardless of the tide, you could swim.
Land for the Central Public Park was acquired in 1901, and it was developed over a period of years. In 1907, it was still described as having rough and uneven ground. But just before the First World War, the park was growing in popularity and regularly attracted large crowds.
The public park in Barrow was very popular. It was an area of about 45 acres which had been bought by the local authority as a public park. And you must remember that in those days, people were living in terrace houses, very cramped conditions, nobody had gardens, and therefore nobody had access to greenery except when they went to the public park, where there were all sorts of facilities laid on, which made it a real day out to enjoy. After the war, the park was very, very popular because, of course, there was a boating lake, there are tennis courts, there are putting greens and all sorts of facilities for ice creams and teas and things like that. And therefore, it was the mecca to which many people made their way and enjoyed themselves for a whole day, probably.
The public park was, of course, a firm favourite for many people because it was a cheap and enjoyable day out, especially with so many amenities. And there were other recreational areas that were crowd pullers. For instance, the James Dunn Park at Vickerstown opened in 1903. It was named after a shipyard manager. Eventually, it became known as Vickerstown Park. A swan pond and bandstand also became big attractions there. Many of the places where people would enjoy themselves before the age of the wireless and television are long gone. The theatres closed, as have the many cinemas which would attract thousands of people every week. The last of the old-style cinemas, the Astra, closed in 1999. It was originally known as the Ritz Cinema and was built to the most modern design of the day, seating up to 2,000 people. During its day, it was also known as the ABC. In fact, the silver screen first came to Barrow in 1910, when the Electric Cinema opened in Buccleuch Street. Now there is a modern cinema complex in